Hey everybody, tighten your buttholes, it's time for Pact.
Nice. I'm the P, Peter Coffin. This is the lovely Miss Astronaut Cowboy Doctor. It's P-A-C-D, Pact. You want to say any more of it?
Yeah, I never say it.
Yeah.
Don't miss an episode. Subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or your favorite podcast service. Also, leave us a glowing review on Audible and Apple Podcasts. We're a 5-star podcast.
Not 2, not 3, not 4.
Wow, I'm better at this.
You are.
I'm a 5-star man. Help us keep the lights on by becoming a patron at patreon.com/pactpod. Your monthly support gets you into the Discord server, gets you exclusive content, and sees some content before everyone else. We've got fantastic Pact merch available too. Finally, tell your friends. We rely so big on word of mouth. We stream 7 p.m. Eastern Time every Saturday.
Every Fatterday.
Every Catterday. Every Saturday. And thank you for tons. Fuck my ass. Thank you tons for tuning in.
So, the supply chain.
That's what I've come to call the great supply chain disruption.
Well, there's a disruption going on in the supply chain. It's pretty big. And I've come to call it the great supply chain disruption. Well, if you listen to Chapo or you listen to like any DSA adjacent left stuff, you just see tons of people taking a dump on anybody who's talking about there being a shortage.
Stop!
Apparently, Chapo did rectify this now. But they started this nice, fun Twitter trend of taking a dump on anybody that acknowledged the supply chain disruption, which is apparently quite great in size. Sorry, you'll get why we're laughing about that in a while.
We are not going to abandon that joke.
Yeah, no. So I was walking through Walmart because that's where we actually do most of our grocery shopping. I went through and there was no pasta. None. I could not buy pasta.
No poultry.
And there was no poultry. There was no chicken.
And of course, we're not saying that this indicates that there's a supply chain disruption happening by our singular anecdotal experiences. But Peter made this observation publicly, and that resulted in then pretty quickly becoming ratioed and being called a fascist, pedophile, rapist, someone who deserves to be castrated, that kind of stuff, for saying, I couldn't find spaghetti and chicken at Walmart today. Oh, and of course, getting shit on for shopping at Walmart.
Yeah, that's the fun part. On one hand, I had people being like, you're a YouTuber. You're not like working class, man.
Yeah.
What you are is this rich asshole who gets everything they want. And then like a section of people were like, you shop at Walmart, you poor piece of shit. It's too bad you can't get any success on YouTube.
Yeah.
And it's like, what the fuck? And the thing is, I don't listen to Chapo Trap House. I didn't know that they started this apparent Americans can't get their treats discourse. I was unaware of this. I was just simply agreeing with somebody who was talking about the supply chain issues. And I said, yeah, I couldn't find any chicken or spaghetti at Walmart today. And like you said, people were calling me a pedophile.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what a lot of these folks, the Chapo types, have been alleging for weeks now is that the reason why anyone would ever complain about this is that there's a shortage on like
treats,
like video game consoles or some luxury good. I guess like some rich YouTubers have complained about having to wait months for a car or something. I don't really know anything about it.
Who gives a fuck?
Yeah, exactly. But because these are the visible people who are talking about it, they attribute the entire issue to that. And they don't think about the fact that, hey, if there's supply chain problems for high profit margin luxury goods, maybe there might be supply chain issues for low profit ratio necessary goods. Just keep your ears out for how the libs frame this discourse, like what goods they're generally talking about, what industries they're generally talking about. And I think you will be able to derive why the initial reaction from this sort of DSA left, which considers itself virtuous and above the working class.
Okay, here's why.
This is a Daily.
On The Daily, which is the New York Times podcast, they interviewed Peter Goodman, a journalist who focuses on trade and the global economy.
Today, a crisis in the global supply chain triggered by the pandemic was supposed to be over by now. It's not, creating economic havoc across the world. Sabrina Tavernisi spoke with our colleague, Peter Goodman, about why that is and what the crisis looks like at a single port.
They asked him about his experiences investigating this at the third largest container port in the United States in Savannah, Georgia.
So where did you go to investigate this?
Well, I went to one of the central parts of the global supply chain that has been coming under tremendous stress, and that's ports. I went to the third largest container port in the United States, which is in Savannah, Georgia.
And he spoke to a gentleman named Griff Lynch, whom he attempts to frame his entire narrative through.
The executive director of the Georgia Ports Authority.
So because of our location, we have cargo coming to us through the Suez Canal, and you'll see that on one of these slides, and the Panama Canal.
I spent the day with the guy who's in charge, Griff Lynch, the executive director of the Georgia Ports Authority, and I wandered around with him to try to sort of see the situation through his eyes. And what I saw was really quite astonishing.
It's so funny how he describes it.
So the port is a strikingly noisy place.
So the striking thing about the port is that it's a very noisy place.
And you hear the clattering of machinery, you hear cranes lifting up containers and dropping them down onto the backs of trucks. You hear some sounds that almost sound like music, strange whirring and chiming.
He has this like fucking literary narrative, like there were whirring sounds like a fucking song at this port, and it was hustling and bustling, like this broody description that has nothing to do with the problem at hand, and then says,
but the most astonishing thing was the sight of this yard full of nearly 80,000 shipping containers. That represents 50% more than usual, and that represents a tremendous backlog. Just filling up acres and acres of land, waiting to be loaded onto ships, waiting to be loaded onto trucks, headed for their next stop. The cranes are working as fast as they can to lift the containers off of ships and onto the land. And as we were speaking, I saw more ships.
So we have about 22 vessels at anchor right now.
Anchored off the port as far away as 17 miles off the Atlantic, waiting for their turn to load or unload at one of the docks. And how long have they been here?
On average, the vessels at anchor would be somewhere between 4 to 5 days.
Because there's been so much cargo just streaming into this port that even this giant port can't keep up. And before the pandemic, how many vessels would you have at anchor?
0.
the port is unable to keep up with the amount that they have, and there are 80,000 containers waiting to be shipped.
Now, normally, somebody who runs a port would be reassured by this sight of business proceeding, and you could tell that Griff Lynch was a little bit agitated.
Nobody has gone through what we're dealing with ever before. Mm-hmm. And so we are inventing this as we go along. There is no day that is the same.
He was looking at the ships the way maybe somebody who's been trying to clean out their garage looks at the UPS truck pulling up to bring more stuff. Where am I going to put all those things?
Yeah, he thinks that's such a fucking funny joke.
Yeah, this is insufferable to listen to.
Yeah.
And so they're trying to figure out how to play catch up with all of this stuff. And the interviewer Our good friend Sabrina asks.
So, what's happening?
Well, the short answer is what I've come to refer to as the Great Supply Chain Disruption.
He said the title.
He said the titular line.
Oh
of the
my
podcast,
God. That's the
of
best
their
part.
podcast.
That's the best part.
So what happened was COVID.
It began, of course, in China, which is the center of global manufacturing.
In China, cities are quarantined, flights cancelled, and factories closed, shutting supply lines crucial to the global economy.
So in February and March of last year, economists widely assumed, we know how this goes. The economy's shutting down in order to choke off the pandemic, and that's going to mean a tremendous loss of commercial activity.
The longer factories and businesses in China remain closed, the more production will be affected too, and this will ripple out to suppliers and customers outside China.
Companies and shipping companies as well responded by cutting capacity. Factories stopped making stuff.
A number of international companies have closed down their operations in China as the coronavirus continues to impact the economy.
The companies that buy things made in factories cut their orders.
American companies doing business in China, including Ford and Apple, have closed factories and retail locations because of the outbreak. Supply chains for products from cars to smartphones are disrupted.
Shipping companies assumed that there'd be a dramatic downturn, which is what happened during the global financial crisis more than a decade earlier. And so they waylaid ships. They said, we're not going to need these ships. They canceled routes, and the productive capacity was sidelined.
We're fucked. Turn everything off. There's no way we're going to be able to sell all that shit that we were making before. We need to stop. We need to hunker down. This is the stopping of the economy.
Right.
That turned out to be a tremendous mistake.
Huge fuck up.
I made a huge mistake.
Yeah.
I made a huge mistake.
Because, yes, people, weren't going to the movies, they weren't going to restaurants, they weren't doing this and that. But, we still needed food. People were rearranging their entire lives so that they could be productive from home through a pandemic and need supplies to do that.
We weren't going to the sandwich place on the corner. We weren't going to shopping malls. We didn't need popcorn at the movie theater anymore. But it's not like life stopped. Suddenly we're outfitting our homes into offices. We're having to entertain our children who are cooped up and not going to school. So we're buying, gaming consoles, baking equipment. We're outfitting our basements and attics into gyms. So we're buying exercise equipment as well.
So if you notice, Goodman frames this through large purchases, video game consoles, exercise equipment, outfitting your basement or attic as a gym, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this is really where the whole treats discourse came from. The whole, it's 100%
Right.
just these fat American slobs who need junk in their house.
This, through a liberal lens, has been focused on, but is typically framed and continues to be framed throughout this specific interview, which is probably the most in-depth investigative journalism that I've seen. But they frame it through this luxurious lens and mention food maybe once. But they acknowledge that that's part of the problem, and they say, yeah, and even things like food and fuel. And then
it's food and fuel are the most important thing.
Yeah.
That's the most important shit. And they just glaze over it it's, this food and fuel are messed up by this too, I guess. And then you have Chapo listen to that or read whatever, and they think, it's all about the treats, man.
Like Stalingrad, if this goes on much longer, could cannibalism be far off? Because people are feral, but they have treats. And without the treats, you're going to be walking around out there. You're going to start looking like a treat. You're going to be looking like a nice big turkey leg on an abandoned island.
Honestly, I've never seen anybody post that kind of thing along with physique, though.
Well, it's just
both of us post physique. Well, I don't often, but we have.
Yeah, we've both posted physique, and we're both hot. It's that simple.
For different reasons.
We're hot for different reasons. I have a huge ass. I do have a huge ass, although that wasn't a joke. That's not a lie. I do have a huge ass.
But anyway, and especially in terms of e-commerce, like putting an even heavier demand on that when people are doing all of this shopping online and from home and still needing, one, sustenance to live, but two, things to rearrange their living environments to make a pandemic livable for themselves.
And this produces a surge of orders for factory goods, many of them, if not most of them, made in China. But there's just one problem with this. We discovered that there aren't enough shipping containers to carry all these products from Chinese industrial cities to ports in the United States.
Why? Why aren't there enough shipping containers?
Well, maybe there are enough shipping containers, but they're not in the right places. You know, let's remember there had been this tremendous need for PPE, face masks, surgical gowns to protect first frontline medical workers, and then every human being trying to go about their lives in the midst of a global pandemic. A lot of this stuff is made in China. And so China is suddenly sending out staggering volumes of PPE to points around the globe. Now, most of the shipping lines traditionally go from places like China to the wealthiest markets, which tend to do most of the consumption. So there's lots of ships that are going from Chinese coastal cities to North America, to Japan, to Europe. Suddenly, shipping containers full of PPE are going everywhere. They're going to West Africa, they're going to East Africa, they're going to South Asia and to Latin America. And these are places that don't traditionally have that much stuff to send back to China. So these shipping containers are piling up in places where they aren't typically in large volumes. At the same time that in the busiest ports in the world, in China, there are no shipping containers. And so factory goods are getting made and there's no container to put them in.
So there are some moving parts to this. It's not that they don't have enough shipping containers. It's that usually most of the shipping from China goes to the wealthiest industrialized places.
Yeah, where consumption is like a primary market.
Right.
Like,
so
it's not just industrial, it's not
the
just...
West.
Yeah.
But now, PPE, personal protective equipment, like medical grade shit for COVID, those aren't just going to North America, Europe, Japan, these high consumer marketplaces. They're going everywhere. They're going to Africa, they're going to South Asia, they're going to Latin America. And those places don't have a lot to send back.
They aren't really big exporter countries.
Right. So they're not exporting things back to China in those containers.
So the containers end up just sitting there.
Right.
They don't send the containers back because the containers are typically a vehicle for the exports.
Right. They just sit there while in China these factory goods are being made and they don't have any shipping containers because the ones in East and West Africa, South and Southeast Asia, Latin America are not being sent back to them. It's when I first listened to this, it sounded like such a basic
dumb problem.
Yeah,
So it sounds like because so much of the economy has come to really rely on the global supply chain, when any little piece of that gets messed up, it has huge ripple effects all the way through the economy.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, everything is connected.
Well, when they say that, it sounds stupid. But then when you actually lay out the investigation onto the table with the information that tells you where things actually are, how they're needed, where they're needed, and why they aren't there, and it's like, oh, well, fuck.
Right. So this results in a delay of goods because there are not shipping containers in China to transport products to these nations. And because of this, shipping companies jack up prices like fuck all.
Yeah, not like a little bit either. They're not like
from like $2,500 to $25,000.
Yeah.
Shipping prices skyrocket. So a journey from, say, Shanghai to the port of Los Angeles that would have been $2,500 to ship a container before the pandemic is suddenly $25,000, a tenfold increase.
Crazy.
Just to put that into perspective, a shipping company would have to do 10 routes before to make the same amount they do in one route now.
So the shipping companies, seeing this tremendous windfall, start shipping empty containers from around the world back to China as fast as they possibly can because the prices are unprecedented. And this now results in traffic jams worldwide. If you count up all the ships and the number of containers they're able to carry, 13% of the total number of containers the world shipping fleet can carry is just stuck somewhere.
Because it's not just piling up in those countries, it's also not being sent to places it would normally be sent in the United States, which would export goods to China.
So containers have traditionally come into ports like Savannah or LA. The stuff gets unloaded, and then often the container is put on a train and carried to the center of the country where, say, a soybean farmer or a wheat farmer loads their crop into that container. And then the container gets railed back and shipped to a buyer in Thailand or Indonesia where soybeans get turned into tofu or turned into animal feed. Well, that's not happening much now because that container that gets unloaded in LA is so valuable to the shipping company. They know they can get this incredible premium on the Asia to LA route that they're inclined to just take the empty container, not wait around to load it up with something else, just put it back on a ship, send it back across the Pacific to Asia to go get the next, wave of Asian factory goods headed for North America. So the soybean farmer is just stuck there, unable to export or having to pay much higher shipping costs to export, which means there's delays in the system, which means there's, a soybean processor in Thailand or Indonesia who now can't satisfy their local demand. So there are people paying more for tofu in Southeast Asia. There are people paying more for chicken because the price of poultry feed has gone up. Again, ripple effects throughout the system.
Right. So places like Savannah, Georgia are just being used just like storage areas. So the way that Goodman describes it is...
this is why Griff Lynch has the mother of all logistical problems. He's got this yard that's full, but the companies that own this cargo he's offloading are often leaving it there. They're not coming to pick up their stuff.
But why aren't they picking it up?
Because their warehouses are full. Because they are so overwhelmed by their own backlog of orders. And in some cases, with the Christmas season already upon us and the knowledge that there are all these supply chain problems, businesses big and small have been ordering well in advance and in excessive quantities. And the result of that is to further swamp the system. So they're essentially using the Port of Savannah as a giant storage area.
This is where he fucking misses the mark completely.
Yeah.
He doesn't talk about this, but meanwhile, all of the employees of all of these companies are having less work to do.
Yeah, so he goes into this a little bit. He uses the example of there's a lumber shortage. And so construction workers might not have the raw materials they need to do the work that day. So they don't work. And then that sidelines their own consumption.
They can't go to the grocery store.
They can't stimulate the economy.
Yeah, exactly. But it's not just like construction workers. It's not just lumberjacks.
Right.
It's every kind of worker that has something to do with the supply chain. And then ultimately that ripple effect goes outside of the supply chain into the service market because there are less things to sell. So there's less of a need for service employees. So service employees are making less. So there's just less money circulating overall.
It's funny because during this podcast, the journalist explaining his findings and what's happened, every now and then the interviewer will say things like, so if one part of the chain is disrupted, that has effects on everything else. And just that shocked that there's a component of what is dialectics involved. Everything is fucking interconnected and you don't need to be a dialectician to know that.
When any little piece of that gets messed up, it has huge ripple effects all the way through the economy.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So we have these companies ordering stuff from China, even though they don't have adequate room to store it.
Why are they ordering stuff from China if they don't have a place to store it? And why don't they have a place to store it?
Well, there are a lot of answers to that question. In part, there's a shortage of truck drivers. Driving a truck has gone from what a long time ago was a good way to support a family at a middle-class standard to a job that, as Griff Lynch put it to me, no parent would ever suggest that their child go into. But there's also, a big picture element that we need to reckon with. And that's that for really 4 decades, publicly traded companies have been under tremendous pressure to go as lean as possible. We've been living through a time when so-called just-in-time manufacturing has been the mantra. Instead of the old days where if you're an industrial company, you make lots and lots of stuff, you pay to keep extra products in warehouses, which involves, paying electrical bills, paying people who work in warehouses, paying to produce stuff that you're not going to sell anytime soon. And we've shifted to this reliance on global shipping and the internet and increasingly sophisticated algorithms that can predict what the demands will be. If you're General Motors or Ford, you can predict with great regularity in normal times, like how many carburetors am I going to need, for this particular model of SUV, rather than stick it in some warehouse, which entails costs. I'll just rely on ships to bring it from my factories in China using the shipping fleet, which is reliable, and it'll arrive just as I need it.
It's almost like a plan.
I was just going to say that.
Which is something that is really useful in a situation like this, but not when the bottom line of finance capital is involved.
Publicly traded companies are answerable to shareholders. And a dollar that they spend warehousing a part as a hedge against some problem in the global supply chain, well, that's a dollar they can't use to pay a bonus to the executives who run that company. That's a dollar they can't use to pay out in dividends to shareholders.
Which is anti-Semitic.
It is. It's anti-Semitic, that finance capital
Only
exists.
if you think that bankers have to be Jewish people.
Which apparently all liberals think.
Yeah, and self-identifying anarchists.
Yeah, all liberals.
Yeah. And then the podcast goes, when talking about this transition to what operates as a planned economy at the dictation of finance capital in the context of still anarchy of production, but they have the resources to adjust to it.
Mm-hmm.
Just-in-time manufacturing that they talk about, and they go into this huge, mind-blowing conversation that the reason that they do that is to lower costs and to give a larger margin to the shareholders.
And so instead of spending money on storing things in warehouses, you're giving that money to shareholders in the form of dividends. You're using that money for other things.
That's right. You're using that money for fun things like making share prices go up instead of for not fun things like worrying about bad things that could happen and having a backup plan.
Which is just like this mind-boggling concept for these two.
Are you sure like a whistleblower didn't put this information out? Because it seems like it should be hidden away from the public.
Yeah.
Maybe Frances Haugen came out and brought this information to them.
No, that's what's so funny about this too. The interviewer's like, so what's really important is the interest of the shareholders in making these decisions.
I never thought of it that way.
God, just shut the fuck up.
So, Peter, what you're saying is that companies now rely on being able to get stuff quickly from all over the world because of the global supply chain and shipping.
Right.
It really is that naive sounding.
It's like horrible to listen to. I stand by my not wanting
I totally
to
agree.
this.
In my opinion, she's playing the ignorant person like on an infomercial.
Like how?
So you're saying I could be cleaning this twice as quick with your product? Really?
But it sounds like when one piece of the chain breaks, the whole thing falls apart, which means it's actually pretty vulnerable.
Right.
Yeah, and because of this, they embark on a conversation of, is this just because of the pandemic? or are things going to stay this way?
So, Peter, is this going to pass? Even though it doesn't feel like it, the pandemic will at some point eventually end. What will happen with this problem? Will it go away, or is it with us for the long term?
Well, if you had asked me that early this year, I would have said conventional wisdom has it that global capitalism will do what it does really well. It'll take its cue from the market. Eventually, shipping will catch up and we'll be back to normal. But that no longer seems entirely assured. And a lot of people now worry that this is a situation that could be with us for quite some time.
The reasons he gives for this is that the pandemic has changed the way that we consume.
On its face, a true statement.
Yes. Of course it is.
Of course.
And what he means by that is talking about consuming through, like, online.
Yeah.
He's talking about e-commerce.
The pandemic has changed how humanity consumes. I mean, think about your elderly relatives who previously were content to go to the supermarket. They didn't want to be bothered with e-commerce. They didn't have apps on their smartphone if they had a smartphone at all. Well, out of fear of contracting a deadly coronavirus, a lot of those people have, in fact, tried e-commerce, and they've discovered that it's pretty convenient. And it's hard to imagine that the world just snaps back to how it was before.
Which really, it's true. The pandemic has been the impetus for a lot of people moving to a more e-commerce focused consumption model.
Which necessitates a lot more delivery.
It's much more complicated. Somebody needs one pair of pants over here. Somebody else wants a couple shirts and a couple pairs of socks over there. That's a lot more delivery than the traditional system where JCPenney or Sears just buys up everything in a giant container and goes to one place and they wait for shoppers to show up. That's more strain on warehouses, on truck drivers, on the whole distribution network.
Yeah, suddenly the stuff isn't collected in stores anymore. It's collected individually in people's homes.
Right. So the idea that we go back to normal has kind of gone out the window. And it's going to take some time for the supply chain to adjust and to figure that out.
Then the traditional market system prior to this, like, almost complete reliance on e-commerce.
And then our man basically says the exact opposite.
Yes.
I mean, we know that the pandemic has just accelerated trends toward e-commerce that most people thought were kind of inevitable already. So we've accelerated into the future. And that e-commerce future puts a lot more strain on supply chains.
This is the way that trends were going anyway. Like, everybody predicted that e-commerce was going to, over time, take over. And he says that the pandemic then accelerated that, which is not what he said a second ago.
One after the other. The pandemic has changed how we consume.
And also, we were going to consume like that anyway.
Yeah, we were trending towards e-commerce, whatever. And then they talk a little bit about how Biden is, like, trying to have 24/7 operations on the port.
President Biden has just announced a deal to go to 24/7 operations there to try to work through the backlog.
So by increasing the number of late night hours of operation and opening up for less crowded hours when the goods can move faster, today's announcement has the potential to be a game changer.
We'll see if there comes a time when they don't have to be 24/7. But presumably adding capacity is a conversation we're going to be having in global shipping for some time.
Which seems to completely just ignore the actual problem that was just discussed.
Yeah.
And they don't address that at all.
Yes, you do need to unload more stuff. Yeah, you do need that. Like, there is a backup, but, like, the backup isn't really the problem. The backup is downstream of the problem. And, like, I figure they imagine Biden is, like, personally affected by this or some shit. Where, like, he's not getting enough cheap aviators from China, or, like, there's an ice cream shortage or some shit. But I just assume that that's what they assume. Because for some reason, they seem to think he's very motivated about this. But again, he's not even addressing the problem.
He was going to come on with, like, a hard hat and a little, like, like, he's going to be working class.
Yeah. Jump on a forklift and fucking, like, move some pallets.
That's how it works. You had to just have flannel shirts and overalls and a little wrench.
Joe the Docker, can he unload it? Can he ship it?
Yeah, come on.
Here, we'll say it. We'll say it together. Can we ship it?
I didn't know where we were starting.
Okay, it doesn't matter.
Okay, so what has happened is our behavior has changed.
So, Peter, what's happened is our behavior has changed, and that's not going away.
But these are also vast, very complicated systems.
But also, these are vast, very complicated systems.
A running gag that continues on for the rest of the interview is how complicated all this is.
How complicated it is, and how this lean model of manufacturing, that is a planned economy that's corrupted by the profit motive and dictation by finance capital, that is the ruling class that owns these large multinational companies, in the context of anarchy of production and late-stage capitalism, fails in terms of getting people the products that they need.
There's no question that, just in time has been running late. And the mantra of lean, is now provoking much discussion of, well, we need more resilience in supply chains. We need to think about backup plans. And the question is, will that lead to actual changes in how we run our economies? This is not the first time that we've had a hiccup in the global supply chain. The stakes are higher.
That model fails for the most part in responding to global crisis, but these large multinational companies with high per consumer profit margins are able to adjust to it and do fine.
Yeah, exactly. The anarchy of production is something that these huge companies that are able to predict and are able to compensate
and are increasingly close to a planned economy for themselves.
Yeah, those folks, they can dig in their heels and weather the storm, so to speak. Goodman mentions Target and Home Depot specifically.
The shipping companies are making extraordinary amounts of money. They are catering to the highest paid customers. I mean, if you're Home Depot or Target and you got to get your stuff from China to your markets in the United States, you're able to pay these extraordinary costs of shipping. In some cases, actually, these companies are chartering their own ships. That's not something that small businesses can do.
These are places, like if you go to Target and you buy something, it's going to cost more than if you buy it at Walmart. Let's say you buy some chicken at Target. Target buys the chicken for $3 and sells it to you for $8, let's say. You go to Walmart, same thing happens. They buy the chicken for $3 and they sell it to you for $4 or $5. Much thinner profit margin. Walmart would definitely see it as less worthwhile to purchase chicken at $3.50 or $4.
Right.
Whereas Target, honestly, they can just absorb it. They've already created a clientele that is used to that price.
Right.
They've already established the supply chain to get it at whatever price. It doesn't even fucking matter. In some cases, there are companies like Target that are actually chartering their own ships and doing their own shipping. And that's not something that, let's say, Joe's hardware shop downtown can do.
And this is where we think Goodman kind of fucks up a little bit. I mean, he especially fucks up in the way that he interprets this problem, but we mean just in his informative appraisal of the situation. It's not just large companies that are able to sustain this. That's a little bit too simple.
It is.
It is the companies with the largest per consumer margins.
Exactly.
Of profit. Not largest profit, because Walmart has huge profits. It's a huge, ginormous, fucking exploitative multinational corporation. It's horrible.
With what we would call a semi-planned economy. Like People's Republic of Walmart is about
it's based
Walmart.
off of that.
But their margins.
Right. The reason that their stores of the franchise are experiencing these shortages is because per consumer, they don't make as much as Target or insert even more expensive chain.
Yeah, like Whole Foods. Whole Foods is the most expensive one out of all of them.
Right. And over again, the shareholders' interests are what are prioritized. And in my notes, I have, no shit. So you would think that from all of this, the conclusion that you should come to is that a planned economy run by the imperialist bourgeoisie and its representative in these large multinational corporations is a failure for everybody else except for them, and results in these supply chain disruptions that fucks over consumers
Although it's posited as somehow the shareholders and consumers' interests somehow align.
Yeah, it says that the shareholders' interests and the consumers' interests align because cutting production costs benefits both the consumer and the capitalist.
Boy, if there's one thing that's been a pretty good bet in the decades that most of us remember, it's that the shareholders' interests are paramount. So, moreover, the shareholder is allied with the consumer interest. And
in what way, Peter?
Which is so fucking stupid because he's so clearly conflating production costs with price.
Just in time has dropped the costs of production and has allowed us to buy goods that are made very efficiently, which makes, your pair of blue jeans, your pair of sneakers cheaper than they might otherwise be. If we're going to have more resilience, if we're going to have warehouses full of stuff to guard against running out of stuff the next time there's a pandemic or some other shock, somebody's going to pay more.
They can still do what they're doing with price and jack up the prices to increase their own profit margin despite lowering production costs. How could you be so stupid? Read value, price, and profit, Peter Goodman?
He immediately contradicts it too, as happens in here multiple times.
What does that all mean for consumers?
It means that consumers are likely to have fewer choices. It means they're more likely to find themselves doing business with one of these giant publicly traded multinational companies that are very efficient, that are very good at tapping suppliers around the globe, and that are intent on making as much money as they possibly can, which in some cases means higher prices.
Okay, so prices go up too.
Potentially. For some things.
The prices go up, yeah.
The prices go up then. And they have to cater to the highest paid consumers.
Because every dollar that they lose on the consumers is one that they can't pay out to their shareholders. He literally outlines right there that these two things are in conflict and not of the same interest.
Yeah, big dummy.
The future looks a lot like the world that we've become accustomed to speeded up, which is to say, the inequalities that were with us before the pandemic are likely to widen in many key ways.
But anyway, the conclusion that you would hope to get from this is that economy planning by and for capitalists in the context of anarchy of production and late-stage capitalism fails in terms of getting people the products that they need.
So it fails at delivering goods to people that need goods, but it succeeds at further monopolizing everything. And while, yes, Walmart is losing when it comes to certain products like chicken, like pasta, sure, they don't have that stuff on the shelves. They do have other stuff on the shelves, and they're still doing fine. So these companies are able to accumulate capital at a faster rate. They're able to get further and further ahead and leave everybody else in a cloud of dust, widening the gap between them and small business and competitors that make less per sale, etc.
And even high-income consumers who can participate and low-income consumers. So you would think, oh, well, that's kind of fucked up that, the shareholders' interests are being prioritized in this whole thing. And the context of the anarchy of production really fucks over, the working class. And late-stage capitalism and a planned economy, in a market economy dictated by imperial capitalists, it doesn't really work out for people. And this is not the conclusion that Peter Goodman comes to.
No.
And he says that the problem is
American consumers in particular, don't have a great history of agreeing to pay more as a hedge against, whether we're worrying about climate change or fair labor standards or shortages in event of pandemic. The lowest price tends to win out, just as the greatest profit potential for shareholders tends to win out. These are the foundational forces in the global economy.
American consumers in particular don't have a great history of agreeing to pay more as a hedge.
This is the ideology of that Exxon fucking
Yes.
that Harvard found in Exxon's communications.
This isn't advertorial.
It's using this exact same ideology of it's consumer demand that drives all of these things.
Right.
When he's laid out a situation.
Selfish fucking American workers trying to feed their families won't pay more to avoid climate change or pandemic crisis. And it's all their fault. Even though 2 paragraphs prior and everything before that, I was talking about the problem being that shareholders' interests are paramount. So he says that. He fucking says that. It's the shareholders being prioritized. And then instead of saying, hey, maybe there needs to be an economic-based system that makes that so it's not the case, he says these poor American bum fucks need to be willing to pay more.
It's not just the profit thing either. He literally describes an entire material analysis of this situation.
Right.
He lays out the actions that happen, where these shipping containers are, how they're being stacked up in all these random ports with nothing to send them back, and therefore they're not bothering to send them back, creating this huge traffic jam. 13% of the entire world's shipping container fleet is now sitting on boats that are anchored outside these ports, not able to be loaded or unloaded. They're just sitting there waiting to go into these ports because this whole situation is log jammed at multiple points. And this problem started at the beginning of the pandemic with this PPE rush. And he's like, American consumers aren't too keen on paying more they won't choose to do it. It's like, bitch.
And that feeds into the fucking goddamn treats thing again.
Yeah, it does. That is a very good point. They're portraying this issue as though it is one of consumers not doing what consumers should do.
Right.
Our consumption has changed.
Luxury consumers
Yeah.
not being willing to pay more because they don't care about the greater good. After saying that the shareholders and the capitalists are the problem without using the latter verbiage. But how this ends is the interviewer asks, you'd think that there'd be somebody like centrally regulating this.
This kind of all brings me to the question of why isn't there someone or some agency at the top of all of this regulating it? I mean, it seems like there should be some kind of global trade czar or something,
Right.
something that would kind of help coordinate all of this.
Well, there is no czar of the global supply chain, and the global supply chain is made up of so many millions of actors in multiple countries on every shore, pursuing their own individual interests, corporate interests, national interests. There's just so many factors that even if you did have some, super international organization that was truly somehow dedicated to maximizing social good, which is a utopian fantasy all by itself, it's very difficult to imagine how they'd even go about their work.
No. So, I mean, even if there was an international organization, that's already a utopian fantasy by itself. But even if there was, there are just too many factors. Imperialism is just too complicated to dismantle. You could never change this. And then it ends with him saying that
the pandemic has exposed the vulnerabilities and has placed the best capitalized, most sophisticated companies in a position to adapt much better than everyone else. So it is likely that the post-pandemic economy will feature more giant companies with sophisticated supply chains, access to global shipping. Those who are set up to weather this best are the ones who are winning to begin with. And it's fair to assume that the winners of all this will be those who already won.
The winners will win.
right. Those who are set up to weather this best are the ones who are winning to begin with, and it's fair to assume that the winners of all this will be those who already won. And he defines this as a moment to realize that nobody is fully in charge.
So what we're all of us experiencing now is a reminder that no one is fully in charge. No one can fully influence many of the key forces that shape the nature of the world that we're living in. And inequality, especially, is a force that's beyond the realm of any actor. And of course, there are profound winners in inequality who influence governments. But not even the largest economy on earth can ultimately tame the great supply chain disruption.
It's very convenient for all the people in charge. And the thing is, this is probably the most in-depth material investigation and analysis that I have seen a lib do. And what do they do? What is their impulse from there? It's to find a way to justify the current system with it.
Yeah.
That is ideologically what working at the New York Times does to you. It turns you into an autopilot justifier of imperialism.
And he doesn't even do it successfully, but still is totally fine with saying that conclusion.
Well, I mean, all the libs who listen to this podcast are probably like, oh my God, that's the smartest shit I've ever heard in my goddamn life. Look at all the detail he went into on this. And then he finds that the free market is actually the thing that we should trust. As a liberal, yes, I do think so.
Right. The free market is the thing that, well, not even that we can trust, but the thing that can't be changed.
As it continues to centralize power among these chains that are planning themselves and finding ways to persist within this anarchy of production. The anarchy of production is not something that disappears when you start introducing these sort of semi-planned sub-economies that exist like in a certain supply chain or a certain company or what have you. Basically closed systems that are kind of doing their own thing according to a plan. Like we said, increasingly sophisticated algorithms allow them to predict what they're going to need, where they're going to need it, what it's for. And they do that instead of just producing a shit ton of stuff and holding it in a warehouse. Now, that doesn't mean it's not subject to the anarchy of production. It just means they've created a more efficient and technically more planned way to produce and distribute in a manner that it does avoid some of the perils of the anarchy of production, but it's also still subject to it in that it kind of uses the anarchy of production to its benefit.
Right. Because it can adapt and all else cannot. That's further monopolizing power.
Exactly. It further imperializes the world because that's what imperialism is.
It further solidifies the monopolistic inevitabilities of late-stage capitalism.
And would Engels have said that?
I don't know.
But I mean, here's the thing. Lenin picked up where Marx and Engels left off. And he showed that analysis brought to the next stage, which was the monopolizing, the financializing of capitalism, which ultimately created capitalist imperialism. This is the result of the clash of the anarchy of production and an anarchy in distribution as well.
Yeah.
With these semi-planned sub-economies that are under tight capital control.
And of larger capital strength than like could have been conceived as possible.
Even in Lenin's time.
Even in Lenin's time. I mean, like, the numbers in Lenin's imperialism chart are like, cute. And, like, how big,
not
like,
even a joke.
He's showing, oh, look how these have increased. And it's like, you'd shit your pants if you saw how things are today.
What's important to understand is that you kind of have both. You have the anarchy of production, and you have the semi-planned sub-economies, and these things interact more or less to strengthen capital's power.
Yeah. Imperialism, the latest stage of capitalism.
End of history.
Yeah.
And you're always going to find this with the New York Times. It's always going to come back to this is the end of history.
The New York Times. It's so strange. It's so strange that all of these like self-identifying communists on the internet, none of them are fucking talking about this, and the ones that are saying like, oh, these fat American working dumbasses don't want to pay more for their treats.
That's all for today. Thanks again for watching or listening. This is Pact. I'm Peter. This is Miss Astronaut Cowboy Doctor. To help us out, click like, follow, subscribe, whatever. Leave us 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts and Audible. To support us, become a patron at patreon.com/PACPOD. That's PACDPOD. Thanks so much, everybody. We will see you next time.